For my second part of the project, I am going to be calculating a theoretical weapon and the physics behind it. So, Project Thor, more or less, is a it was like a theoretical weapon that could have been developed, and the idea was like originated during like the Cold War era. And the idea was relatively simple. Drop a tungsten rod from really high up and destroy buildings and cities with kinetic energy. So, for the most part, the dimensions of these tungsten rods are cited as so for most videos and articles on it. The length of the rod would be 6 meters, the radius would be 0.3 meters, giving it a total volume of 0.4 meters cubed. Um, Obviously, it's made from tungsten. The reason it's made from tungsten is due to its high boiling point, as it can resist very high temperatures, so we don't have to really worry too much about it losing mass on the way down. We know that the density of tungsten is 19.3 grams per centimeters cubed, or about 19,300 kilograms per meters cubed, leaving us with a tungsten rod with a mass of about 7,000 kilograms. So it's the mass that's generally important here. Volume, not too much of a worry. And the reason they are in these long cylindrical, almost like missile-like shape here is to provide as little cross-sectional area for air resistance as possible, because obviously dropping a sheet of paper from space with a mass of 7,220 kilograms is a lot less deadly than having an orbital lawn dart shot at you. So just make sure, like, as long as there's a minimal, you're able to fit more like mass behind a cylindrical shape than you can with, like, let's say a ball. So that's the reason why it's shaped as such. So it's more aerodynamic and you can fit more stuff behind it. So we are going to calculate the amount of energy something like this would yield, because for the most part, dropping something really high from the sky does a lot of damage, as you can see with like the first example where this was ever tested being the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were hit with a giant meteor, and that wiped out most of the global fauna on the planet, killing almost everything. So dropping things from the sky is really, really, really effective as a means of destruction. So we're going to be calculating that. So kinetic energy initial, we're going to be using the work energy theorem, right? We know that work is zero as it's simply just dropping from the sky. So we can rearrange the equation as such. And we're going to be isolating for final velocity here, because that's what's important. So we're just going to rearrange the equation here. So gravitational constant, mass, and mass. We can cancel out all the little masses. So for speed, the mass of the object that is falling is negligible. And since we're using the gravity of the Earth, that would be the bigger m here would be the mass of Earth. So when we're going to isolate for that, we're gonna use that as our variable. Sorry. So we have a radius initial, we have a radius final because it's dropping from low orbit, and for the most part the calculation remains the same if you've watched the first video that I made on orbital potential energy. The final velocity would be 7,882 meters per second. So that's going to be the velocity we're going to be using here. So the kinetic energy is going to be equal to, so 1 over 2 mv squared. We have the mass, which is calculated up here. And we now have the velocity. So that's going to yield us a kinetic energy yield of 2.24 times 10 to the 11 joules. However, this is without air resistance, and as you can see with like paper, for example, air resistance is incredibly important. it's going to reduce that speed a lot. And according to a 2003 US Air Force report on air resistance, the velocity that we discovered, so 7,882, would be reduced to about 3,000 meters per second, which is still ridiculously fast. But plugging that into our kinetic energy equation, it's going to yield us about 10 times less kinetic energy. Still, how much energy is 3.2 times 10 to the 10 joules? Because from a like equation perspective, that's just a number. So, for reference here, the mother of all bombs has a yield of 4.602 times 10 to the 10 joules. So incredibly close to our answer that we got here. It's off by like maybe a couple values here. It's not off by too much actually. So here's a video of what that actually looks like. Though it's not on the scale of like nuclear like bombs, there is still lots of application to be done with that because that is still a ridiculous amount of energy. Like that's enough to topple a building. That's enough to take out a capital ship. That is enough to destroy most like high value targets. It's able to destroy bunkers. It's a bunker buster more or less. But what are the pros to this? Why use this when we already have bombs? Well, with bombs, you have to drop them from airplanes overhead, and for the most part, because they're from airplanes overhead, they kind of fall relatively slow, so they can be quite easily countered with like anti-bomb technology, so anti-air, anti-missile technology. Even missiles, they can be countered relatively easy with anti-air, anti-missile technologies. But if you're dropping a tungsten rod from the sky, because of the lack of technology on board a rod, all you would really need is just like maybe like a tiny GPS and like a tiny engine to readjust its entry when coming in to hit the object or hit the target more accurately. There's not really much you need to put on a tungsten rod from space. It's basically just like a lawn dart. And it's moving ridiculously fast. 3,000 meters per second is incredibly fast. It would be almost impossible to try to dodge it in any way. So moving a shit like an immobile object, like an aircraft carrier, or like a giant ship kind of floating in the ocean, it's very hard to move it out of the way because it kind of comes within 15 minutes and is moving at ludicrous speeds. It's hard to detect because there's no technology on board, so you can't really detect any electricity from it. It's hard to counter it, you can't really move it, and you can't really block it because it is falling from the sky at a ridiculous speed, and it's really hard to shoot out of the sky because it's moving so fast. But you might be wondering, why don't we use this type of technology at all for military purposes? Well, when the idea was originally developed, moving objects into space was very, very expensive. But now, with newer innovations in space travel, the amount it really costs to move into space has gone down a significant amount. So, for example, the Falcon Heavy, that was the most recent spacecraft, the Falcon Heavy, I believe it was by SpaceX. The cost of moving things into space is now $1,300 a kilogram. So calculating that with the mass of a singular tungsten rod leaves you with about $9 million per rod. The Moab, the mother of all bombs, as seen in that video there, costs $16 million per bomb and is relatively easy to counter compared to the Rod from God or Project Thor. So, not only now in modern day is it more cost effective to actually use these sort of rods, it's actually a lot better because there's more benefits to it, right? There's more pros, and it's harder. It's a lot harder to counter. So it's seemingly the better weapon. So why don't we use it? Well, there's actually a reason behind that, and that's kind of because space is considered international space. So, for example, the United States, the space doesn't actually belong to the United States. It belongs to all of us, more or less. So, putting a weapon in space is technically against like peace laws. So we don't really have a need for it either, actually, because now in modern times we don't have any all-out wars like we did back in World War II, in World War One. For the most part, it is just smaller skirmishes or just inter-country conflicts. So, for example, the like fighting in the Middle East for the most part is not worldwide. It's just in like a small area. So these type of weapons aren't really needed anymore. But with the cost and evolution of space travel and space transportation, this is now considered technically a viable option as a weapon. So that would be the worldwide application. This would be like the real world application, as even though it is rather ludicrous, it does have real world applications and could absolutely be used in the future. And yeah.